Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday, the 7th of March. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. First, we will have an update with the headlines relating to the events in Ukraine. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines. Ukraine has criticised a proposal by Moscow to open refugee corridors as immoral and unacceptable, after the Russian Defense Ministry announced civilians fleeing some cities would only be allowed to leave for Belarus or Russia. Food, water and medicine and almost all other supplies are in desperately short supply in Mariupol, from where an estimated 200,000 people are trying to flee. The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has warned that as many as 5 million Ukrainians are expected to flee the country if the Russian invasion continues, adding that Europe needs to ready itself for huge numbers of refugees. More than 1 million Ukrainians have fled to Poland since the start of the Russian invasion, with 142,300 people arriving on Sunday alone. The Polish government has said it will create an 8 billion zloty, that's about $1.75 billion fund to help the war refugees. The British government has denied that the UK is to offer Ukrainian refugees a new humanitarian-based route to the country, and has confirmed it was possible that only 50 people have been granted visas so far. Russia has snubbed a hearing at the United Nations top court into a legal bid by Kyiv to halt Moscow's devastating invasion of Ukraine. And China says it is open to helping to mediate peace, but has stressed that the friendship between Beijing and Moscow is still very strong. Almost 5,000 people were detained for demonstrating in Russia on Sunday, according to an independent monitoring group. And the death toll remains unclear. The UN has confirmed a few hundred civilian deaths, but also warned that numbers are likely to be a vast undercount. Police in Kharkiv said on Monday that 209 people have died there, 133 of them civilians, and the UN, just before we came on air, have indicated that they can confirm so far 406 civilians have died. Russia has instructed all state-owned websites and services to switch to the Russian domain name system by the 11th of March, and this is according to Russian state media outlets. Many fear the move is a sign that Russia is beginning active preparations for disconnection from the global internet. And meanwhile, hacking collective Anonymous claimed to have hacked into the Russian TV streaming services Wink and Ivy, and also into the live TV channels Russia 24, Channel 1, and Moscow 24, in order to broadcast their own footage from Ukraine. Now, we're lucky this evening to be joined on Scotland at 7 by Kaukab Stewart. Kaukab has been the Scottish National Party member of the Scottish Parliament for Glasgow Kelvin since May 2021. At that election, she succeeded another great friend of broadcasting Scotland, Sandra White. Kaukab also increased the SNP's share of the vote at that election by nearly 3%. At the election, Kaukab became the first woman of colour elected to our Scottish Parliament, and prior to her election, she had almost 30 years' experience as a teacher, whilst also pursuing her political career. Kaukab, good evening. How are you?
Good evening, Andrew. I'm very well. Just can't help but think about the terrible things that are going on internationally, but I am well. Thank you for asking.
I'm glad to hear it, and thank you for coming to join us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Firstly, heavy Russian shelling was preventing civilians from evacuating 6 cities, Ukraine's foreign ministry has said, just hours after Moscow announced the opening of humanitarian corridors that Kyiv has dismissed as immoral and unacceptable. Today, Russia announced that its forces would hold fire to allow civilians to leave the cities, the capital Kyiv, the second city Kharkiv, and the southern urban centres at Mariupol, Sumy, Volnovkaya, and Mykolaiv. But Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Irina Vereshchuk, dismissed the proposed routes as unacceptable. After it emerged, only 2 led to elsewhere in Ukraine, with all the others heading straight to Russia or pro-Russian Belarus. As Russian forces continued their bombardment, including of residential areas, on the 12th day of fighting since the invasion began, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian presidency said civilians must be allowed to escape through Ukrainian territory. This is completely immoral, the spokesperson said, a day after attempts to evacuate the southern city of Mariupol and others failed when fleeing citizens came under fire. They should have the right to evacuate to the territory of Ukraine. Russia wants to supply humanitarian aid for pictures on TV and wants the corridors to lead in its direction. The Foreign Ministry said continued Russian shelling was in any case preventing the safe passage of humanitarian columns as well as the delivery of medicines and food, and they called on foreign leaders to force Russia to observe a ceasefire. A further round of talks between Ukraine and Russia has been taking place at the Belarusian border again today. However, there is not much optimism that there will be a positive outcome. Now, Kaukab, we've all been scrolling on our phones and tablets, and we've been watching the news even more than usual. So, what has struck you most about the news from Ukraine over the past few days? Firstly, I mean, what has struck you about the events in Ukraine that you've been watching?
Well, I think that, I mean, there's scenes that, to be honest, I didn't think that I would be seeing. It's just absolutely heartbreaking seeing families, children, women, the elderly that are fleeing for their lives. Sort of like what, 12 days ago, they were just going about their business, recovering from COVID. And then suddenly, not everything has been turned upside down, but the sheer terror that is in their eyes, sort of seeing families falling over on the street, fleeing from the shelling that is now going on and hearing that noise as well, that kind of sort of like the sensory impact that they must be going through. It just absolutely fills me with horror about that. And also, I suppose I'm looking at, we're looking in on it, and I'm trying to imagine what it's like for Ukrainians over here that have family there. I mean, that's possibly their mothers, their grandparents, their nieces, their nephews. That's relatives that they're so worried about. So, yeah, it's just absolutely heartbreaking.
That's a very good point. You make Kaukab. Certainly, I was reflecting this morning, obviously, firstly, in terms of civilians who are Ukrainian civilians who are being attacked and being killed now in increasing numbers. But it also struck me as well that the majority of the Russian soldiers are young conscripts who have no idea why they're there, and certainly have no issue in which to be fighting with Ukraine, and that their families will be missing their sons. They're largely men. Will be missing their sons when they die in action as well. So the impact on families across Europe. I think your point's absolutely right. I was also going to ask you about what has struck you about the events elsewhere than in Ukraine, but which are associated with the worldwide response to the illegal invasion. Oh, I think we've lost Kaukab for a moment. We'll just check and see where we get to with that. As ever at this time of the evening, as people are finishing their dinners, the internet gets busy, and we can lose connections sometimes. We'll work to bring Kaukab back to us, and we'll continue with the conversation with her relating to the events in Ukraine and also the events worldwide, which are unfolding at the. I'm sure she'll be rejoining us shortly, and will continue to participate. It certainly crossed my mind, and I've said it on Broadcasting Scotland before, that people often think that Scotland and Ukraine are very different. We in Scotland live in a formerly maritime nation, a country far out on the edge of the North Atlantic. Oh, I think I'm hearing that Kaukab is rejoining us. I made the point that we're out on the edge of the North Atlantic, whereas Ukraine is in the heart of Europe. But I've got a theory that there are similarities. But anyway, we'll share that another time because Kaukab's come back to us. Kaukab, can you hear
Right,
me?
sorry about that. I don't know what happened. My screen just went absolutely dead, but I've managed to get back on, so we're fine.
Worst things happen at sea. Thank you for persevering with us and coming back on. That's grand. So I was going to ask you what you've been watching and scrolling through and reading. What has struck you most about events elsewhere? So these are events that are associated with what's happening in Ukraine that are not actually in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I think that I mean, I'm heartened at the response internationally. I have to say that I'm a wee bit disappointed with the UK's response. Perhaps we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. But at the moment, it appears that places like Poland, for instance, France, so many nations are doing absolutely everything they can to support the humanitarian crisis that is there by taking in refugees and taking care of them. And also the sanctions that obviously there's a lot of diplomatic efforts that are going on in the background to make sure that there is some kind of de escalation, which we desperately need. I was talking about this last week, and at that time, we hadn't seen the extensive bombing and shelling that was going on, and that has escalated greatly. So again, it's an incredibly anxious time about where this is all headed, really. But I am very heartened by the response of the EU countries and the neighbours, and actually across the world, where people are trying their absolute best to bring Putin to the table and have some kind of reasonable response, which at the moment isn't looking very hopeful. But we must continue with those diplomatic efforts.
That's absolutely right, and certainly it strikes me that there may be a contrast there. As I mentioned, the Polish government are now establishing a fund simply purely to help the refugees of about 1.75 billion US dollars. The Westminster government proudly proclaimed that they were adding another 100+ million pounds to their donations, which brings them to about, they said, about 400 million so far, and those are funds being provided to the Ukrainian authorities.
Yeah,
It did strike me that there is perhaps a difference there between the responses we're seeing from different governments, but I'm not seeing a contrast in the response that we're seeing from people. My point being that we've seen so much in the way of response from citizens of Berlin turning up at the railway station offering to take in and to help transport refugees. The photographs we saw, I think, last night or this morning of the row of baby strollers left by Polish people to help mothers bringing young children across the borders. The kind of rows of baby strollers and prams that you might have seen outside a nursery in a
yeah,
previous life. So and also people of Scotland in terms of both raising funds and organising and collecting materials and trying to dispatch them to Ukraine and to the borders in order to help. And even people taking direct action this afternoon. A very angry Irish truck driver has reversed his truck through the gates of the Russian embassy in Dublin, protesting about the civilian deaths that he'd seen on his TV. What do you think it says insofar as there's a contrast between the reaction of some governments, but it seems that people are all being motivated in the same way.
Yeah, so I think that it shows the contrast here at how humans want to have that connection, they have that empathy, they have that compassionate response to this humanitarian crisis. And, it is always the civilians that end up suffering in war the most. They're the ones that lose the most. And I mean, in my own constituency, I know that even they call themselves the mammies, and all the mammies got together and started it was collecting sort of useful things that could be sent over. And they were collecting them at the local Hindu temple, actually. And they were inundated with so much stuff that they had to then ask people not to do that. And of course, the DEC have now said that the best way to contribute is to donate the money so they can then then buy the medical equipment that's required and make it more bespoke, the stuff that's actually needed. Because I know that there was sort of like a deluge of clothing that was donated, but the children, they're also going to need toys as well to try and do something to help them still be children and hang on to that to a certain extent. But the other point is that you're right, totally contrasts with the UK government's response. So they are coming out with all this money now, but actually they have had to be pushed and pushed and pushed. And it's been the demand from the people and the population here that has actually demanded that and pushed them towards it. They haven't volunteered that. I mean, I was calling for, waiving of visas. And following what other countries had done was to say, actually, do you know what? Let's get the people over here and we can deal with the paperwork later. People first, paperwork later. But this UK government, it just seems to be, they're so entrenched in their hostile environment approach to anybody coming into this country that they can't seem to get away from it. And even the appalling bit of putting caveats in the way that you had to be related, you had to get a sponsor. I mean, this is an emergency situation. So there shouldn't be any hurdles in the way. And, smaller countries, other independent nations are sort of taking, a fair percentage of their population in as refugees. And am I correct in thinking that the UK government has only granted 50 visas to Ukrainian sort of people? Is that correct?
That was reported over the weekend. James cleverly did the rounds, brought on with the broadcasters this morning, and denied that. He said he didn't, as happens now with Tory ministers, he said he didn't recognise the number 50, but refused point blank to confirm what the real numbers are. And I think the UK government has said, I heard Priti Patel tell the House of Commons this afternoon that she will confirm what the number is tonight. But
Yeah.
you can be sure, I think, that in contrast to the more than 1,300 people who have been given refuge in Ireland, the more than 1 million who've been given refuge in Poland, the number in the UK, it feels like it's going to be, it's not 50, it's 51. And so you
Yeah,
mentioned hostile.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Pippa.
sorry. Yeah, the hostile environment. As I said, I just think that the structures here, when it comes to sort of immigration, and also sort of like dealing with refugees, asylum seekers in the bigger sense of things, it's just so. Well, I've always sort of campaigned against that. I think that people add to this country. It adds to that rich tapestry. It adds to our economy and our culture, actually. We're the better for it. But as I said, I've always thought that, this UK government, the policies that it makes are actually to prevent that from happening. And yet we have a skills shortage. We have sort of like vacancies that need to be filled. And there are people, I mean, not in this particular case, obviously people are fleeing for their lives and they need sanctuary, and that's the important thing. But on the wider level, we are not a welcoming nation. And frankly, that it's a national embarrassment. And as I said earlier, the general population have responded in a compassionate way. So this government is becoming increasingly isolated in their reaction to this humanitarian crisis, really. And they should just waive the visas. And should you really be having any kind of quotas on human life? Actually, I would say no, you shouldn't. That is immoral when people are literally fleeing for their lives. I've been hearing reports again. You don't know, what's true and what isn't. So I'll put that caveat in. But even folk that have got Airbnbs, they're stepping up and volunteering their premises. People are volunteering themselves as hosts. So we can take care of the people. We can do that. We want to do that. When you see people in so much distress and in so much need, we all want to do something. did you see the pictures of the queues outside the Ukrainian bakeries in the south
Yeah,
side?
yeah, yeah.
And it's because people feel powerless and they want to help. You want to create, um, you have those connections and you want to offer that support. And we can do that as humans on an individual level. But I think in the bigger impact of things, the government needs to step up and provide the support that is necessary.
No, that's a very good point that you make, Kaukab. The Deanston Bakery in Glasgow over the weekend, there was a bakery in Edinburgh, a company bakery, who were doing the same. And I was frustrated. I was working, so I didn't get a chance to go and buy some of their lovely Ukrainian pies. But as you say, people both renting Airbnbs in Kiev and just sending the money, or people
Uh-huh.
offering Airbnbs back here. And I heard a story this afternoon of a lady who had ordered toys from an online toy manufacturer, and a person who makes toys herself in Ukraine.
Mm.
And the person bought £50 worth of toys and had said, "I do not expect these to be delivered." The person who
Mhm.
manufactures them, who makes them, had then responded and said, "Well, once there's peace, I will send you the toys." So your point's absolutely right. People are innovating and are finding ways to support each other in such difficult times. But let's move on, because there's lots of aspects of the events in Ukraine that I want to talk to you about. And firstly, the SNP has ramped up pressure on the UK government to strengthen measures to tackle economic crime in the UK and the flow of dirty money streaming through the UK under its watch. The party's Shadow Chancellor, Alison Thewliss MP, welcomed the Economic Crime Bill, which is being debated in Parliament today, but has urged UK ministers to consider further amendments to the bill to close potential loopholes and give new commitments on the pace of the next Economic Crime Bill. The SNP has repeatedly pressed the UK government to take action on Companies House, which allows dirty money to be laundered through UK shell companies, including Scottish limited partnerships. The party has now brought forward an amendment to the Economic Crime Bill, which would aim to make Companies House an anti-money laundering supervisor and to register as part of the UK government's Verify scheme. Commenting, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewliss MP said, "While the Economic Crime Bill is welcome and long overdue, the UK government must heed the warnings and look to strengthen measures in order to close the loopholes and effectively tackle economic crime." So, Kaukab, I appreciate that Companies House and company law is not devolved. It's retained in Westminster. However, there are Scottish aspects of this, and there are there are UK-wide aspects of this. So, firstly, given its reported and apparent dependence on ultimately Russian-sourced finance, are you surprised that the Tory government in Westminster is going ahead with its economic crime bill?
Well, I'm not surprised now. I think they've probably been embarrassed into it because, from what I believe, it has come up before and it was sort of kicked into the long grass and they dragged their heels with it. And I think now that there is so much discussion about sort of dirty money and sort of Russian oligarch money, and now they have no choice. So it's another example of being embarrassed into bringing it forward. And I do believe that I think it's like, all the different stages are going through quite rapidly. So, yeah, I mean, it's happening. I mean, I know that the SNP is supporting it, and I'm glad that we've put the amendment in to close off the loopholes. But what's interesting about this is that, the advance warning of it, I mean, it's part of the sanction is to cut off that money. And, our government sort of like gives them sort of 30 days notice basically to get their money out and to deal with all the assets. So it's like giving them a heads up in a sense. So again, it shows how entrenched that kind of mindset is in this government, which is really disappointing. It's really disappointing.
It absolutely is. Thanks, Kirkham. Let's look at another aspect now, and something we've already touched on, because the SNP has called for a complete overhaul of Home Office policies towards Ukrainians who are fleeing the Russian invasion. The call comes following reports that only 50 Ukrainian family members have been granted visas to come to the UK despite 13,500 applying to the scheme. In contrast, Ireland has already welcomed over 1,300 Ukrainian refugees since the war began, and estimate a further 80,000 will arrive. The SNP's Shadow Home Secretary, Stewart MacDonald MP, has urged the UK government to bring forward a serious humanitarian response to what is now being called the fastest migration of refugees since World War II, and that should include simple and safe routes for those fleeing prosecution, as well as scrapping the Nationality and Borders Bill. In addition, Mr MacDonald has also called for the UK to follow its European neighbours by scrapping visa requirements for Ukrainians who are seeking safety. The UK government's policy towards Ukrainian refugees has been thrown into chaos after Priti Patel's pledge to introduce a new humanitarian route to enter the UK was contradicted by Downing Street and other ministers. Sources close to the Home Secretary confirmed reports that she was pushing through proposals for a third scheme that would enable refugees from the war-torn country to escape invading Russian forces. But Number 10 appeared to deny there would be a third refugee route, while Boris Johnson emphasised that the government would not grant Ukrainians permission to enter the UK without the requirement that they go through asylum procedures. Of the 1.3 million plus Ukrainians who have fled the country since Russia invaded, the UK has thus far said it will only take those who have family connections or that have been sponsored by a third party. Commenting, the SNP Shadow Home Secretary Stewart MacDonald MP said, "These figures show just how lamentable and heartless the Home Office's response has been. Each and every day we hear strong rhetoric from the UK government about how they will support those fleeing the war, but that rhetoric is not being matched with any appropriate action." So Kaukab, where to start with this? We'll talk more about Westminster's omni-shambles later on this evening, I hope. However, what do you think that the Westminster government's response is so far? Is it lamentable? Is it incompetence, or is it heartless, and is it malicious towards asylum seekers and refugees?
Do you know, honestly, I think it's a combination of all these things. And as I said earlier, they've got this entrenched attitude that they don't know how to do anything differently. And it's only when they're pushed to it and shamed into it that they do start to act. And remember, we have, I feel that it's quite a heartless and draconian system for asylum seekers and refugees that we have. And what they're trying to do is to sort of tweak around the edges of a system that actually doesn't work, and it doesn't have a human rights-based approach or a compassionate approach at the heart of it. So I would be saying rip it up and start again in that sense. Really, but it is absolutely lamentable. We have the capacity, we have the will to be able to support humans, and we don't do that. And I also worry, just to sort of broaden it out a little bit with the people that are leaving. One thing that's coming through my inbox a little bit is about the treatment towards Ukrainians of colour. And how there appears to be some kind of disparity between that as well. So I think there's sort of biases and biases on top of that are coming through. So we must be very careful to remember that actually Ukrainians, there are Black Ukrainians as well. And regardless of the colour of their skin, they are refugees and fleeing from quite a traumatic, dreadful thing that is going on at the moment, and they should all be treated equally by nations that are receiving them, and we certainly need to do better in receiving them. And remember, Glasgow, is a dispersal hub, so we have taken in refugees before, and we can do that again.
Absolutely, Kaukab. Thank you. And that the point you're making with regard to the open arms that Scotland and Glasgow and Scotland has shown to refugees and asylum seekers from Syria and from other war zones. And I was reflecting on the likelihood that we will be doing that again very soon for people who are fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, as we found with our recent experience with other asylum seekers, they are very pleased to come to Scotland, and Scotland is very pleased to have the opportunity to offer them some care and protection after such traumatic events and circumstances. But let's move on and look at another aspect of this, because the International Court of Justice has said it will decide as soon as possible on a Ukrainian demand for an emergency order that Russia halt hostilities immediately after a hearing in The Hague that was boycotted by Moscow today. The UN's highest court closed a hearing this afternoon a day earlier than planned because of the Russian boycott. Ukraine said that Russia was obliged to listen to whatever the International Court of Justice ruled. The court is using a fast-track procedure that can bring a ruling on provisional redress in days. There is no chance of Russia complying with any ruling, but it will deal another blow to Moscow's waning diplomatic prestige. Ukraine accuses Russia of illegally justifying its war by falsely alleging genocide in the self-proclaimed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. The case is one of a number being taken by Ukraine to international courts in an attempt to secure a ruling that Russia is acting illegally or committing war crimes. Acting for Ukraine in the court, David Ziont said, Ukraine comes to this court because of a grotesque lie and to seek protection from the devastating consequences of that lie. The lie is the Russian Federation's claim of genocide in Ukraine. The consequences are unprovoked aggression, cities under siege, civilians under fire, humanitarian catastrophe, and refugees fleeing for their lives. The ICJ was set up after the Second World War to rule on disputes between UN member states, based mainly on treaties and conventions. Its rulings are binding, but it has no real means to enforce them. The ICJ's president, Joan Donoghue, said that the court regretted Russia's non-attendance. The ICJ is empowered to give a ruling when one of the parties does not attend, to give evidence, whether in writing or in person. Ukraine wants the court to take provisional measures, ordering Russia to immediately suspend the military operations, pending a full judgment on the dispute, and that could take years. Kaukab, Russia says it's acting in compliance with the UN Charter in order to prevent a genocide, which it claims has been committed against Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Putin has said that Russia's special military action is to protect people who have been subjected to bullying and genocide. Now, the leading association of genocide scholars has backed the view of Ukraine and Western powers that Russia is misappropriating the term genocide to describe the treatment of Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine. There is absolutely no evidence that there is genocide going on in Ukraine. Melanie O'Brien, who's the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, has told Reuters. Now, I know that the law can move slowly sometimes, but is the hearing today, is it an indication perhaps that the International Court of Justice is steadily and surely, one by one, stripping away the lies and falsehoods used by President Putin to justify his illegal invasion?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that that is happening, and it's going to happen more and more. I think that you're seeing more and more nations across the world that are seeing through this. And I don't know who it was that said it, but the first casualty of war is the truth. And we have to be very vigilant and very mindful of the misinformation and also malinformation as well, because there is clearly, well, it's propaganda, isn't it? It's war propaganda that comes out. And I suppose this is where I would like to pay tribute to the journalists that are working out in the war zone and doing their absolute best to bring us verified and correct information. And of course, Putin won't like that. So in sort of like an attack to undermine that, inevitably he's going to put out his own spin on it to justify it. There can be no way that you can, sort of like justify what's going on in any way whatsoever. But that's not going to stop him. What I'm concerned about is the more and more irrational behaviour and the lack of compliance with international diplomatic efforts. That does concern me to a great deal. I would imagine that it is concerning the Russian people, and I have no doubt that the majority of the Russian people are not for Putin's actions, and they will be saying, "Not in my name." But of course, because of media lockdowns, we have no idea of what they're actually thinking or saying within the country because Putin won't be reporting that. So, yeah, I think they've all made a good point, the people that you've referred to earlier.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kaukab. Now, what we'll do is we'll switch our focus away from Ukraine for a moment, and there are other news items that I'd like to discuss with you this evening, and so we'll move from Ukraine. And firstly, let's talk about the SNP, which has called on Anna Sarwar to drop a former Orange Order Grand Master, Henry Dunbar, as a Labour candidate for the upcoming local council elections. Mr Dunbar was announced as a Scottish Labour candidate for the Airdrie North ward, despite claims from the party that all their candidates would be open and tolerant. A number of anti-sectarian organisations, such as Show Racism the Red Card and Call It Out, have condemned the move and claimed that Labour can no longer speak credibly on bigotry, hatred and inequality. Commenting, the SNP MSP Colette Stevenson said, "In Anas Sarwar's desperation to find candidates for the local elections, he has thrown out all principle and opened his arms to an ex-leader of a deeply divisive organisation. It simply beggars belief that Scottish Labour think this is appropriate, but it shows how far they have sunk. Anas Sarwar must immediately drop Henry Dunbar as a candidate for the council elections. The politics of division have no place in Scotland." So, Kaukab, thinking firstly about the apparent decision by Scottish Labour to select Mr Dunbar as a candidate for Airdrie North, what do you think are the messages that are being communicated by the newly rebranded Labour Party in Scotland? What the messages about a very prominent member of the Orange Order being selected as a candidate? And I'm thinking both about messages that they're sending to supporters of independence, but also the messages that they're sending to unionists.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think, firstly, on the decision to select candidates, obviously, it's up to each individual party. Certainly, there are vetting procedures that have to be gone through, and then a selection process. So, this particular candidate, I assume, would have gone through that robust process. And I do find it difficult to believe that they wouldn't have picked up on this. It's come so far. Did they not think that this decision would be questioned? Also, from an AS's point of view, I find it surprising that they're doubling down on this decision because the Labour Party and the leader, Anas Sarwar, preaches quite often about tolerance and respect. However, this looks to me as though it is just shy of stopping at Labour's door. So they need to look at this very carefully. But I do take the point that, leaders can't always interfere in local decisions of candidates that are selected. But I do recall during my election, prior to that, there was a Labour candidate that was selected to stand in Glasgow Kelvin. And she was perceived to be open to the idea of an independence referendum and felt that maybe Labour should actually consider that and not be so hard on it. And she was deselected. So there is a precedence that has been set before where the leadership have intervened to support a deselection of a candidate that was selected. So I don't understand why it couldn't happen here. And I would concur with, Show Racism Red Card and other organisations that have made the comment that this is a deeply divisive organisation. And, for me, an independent Scotland is genuinely tolerant. And that also means that we don't accept bigotry, we don't accept violence, we don't accept, not that I'm connecting all of these things, but you understand my bigger point on that. I think the other point that you asked about was the rebranding. I think you can rebrand as much as you like. You can spend as much money as you want on having thistles or this, that, and the next thing. But at the end of the day, it's the policies that really matter. It's the vision that you have for Scotland. And I would put the point that I think Labour is still not getting it. That the Scottish people are actually looking at the omni shambles that comes out of Westminster and thinking we can do better than this. A lot has happened since the last referendum. I mean, we've had Brexit, for instance. There's been massive, massive changes. And there are more and more people that are actually thinking, as an independent nation, we could do much, much better than this. And Labour are just not getting that. They're holding on to Westminster with their dear life. And I think that if they want some kind of electoral success in the future, then they do need to be cognizant of the feeling of the Scottish people and the direction of travel, which I do think is towards independence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kaukab. I was going to also ask you about what you thought Keir Hardie would be saying if he was aware of what was going on, but that's a matter for the Labour Party in Scotland in particular. So we'll ask them that question. We'll not trouble you with it. What we will do, however, is move on to the next item, which is that the SNP has demanded changes to the universal credit system after it was revealed that almost half of all Scottish households claiming the benefit are being hit by a staggering £10 million a month poverty tax. The SNP MP Chris Stevens uncovered through a parliamentary question that in 1 month alone last year, 180,000 households in Scotland had an average of £60 deducted from their social security payments, according to official figures. The majority of these, 44%, was to pay back advance payment loans issued by the Department for Work and Pensions to see people through the 5-week waiting period for their first universal credit payment. In 10 Scottish constituencies, over half of claimants are having their benefits clawed back to some extent, with average monthly deductions ranging from £57 to £62 per household. So, Kaukab, firstly, we touched on this very briefly on the Full Scottish yesterday. So in a way, I'm glad that we're able to look at this evening a little bit more. The point was made yesterday that many of the families are already paying back loans to the Westminster government, and if they are to have any chance of heating their homes this year, they're just about to have yet another loan foisted upon them in terms of the reduction in energy payment or the deferring of energy payments. So, are you surprised that what we see now is a government that apparently is run by payday moneylenders and loan sharks?
Yeah, it's difficult not to think that, isn't it? I think that, certainly sort of like grants. That's a short-term fix and it has to be paid back by the very people who don't have the money in the first place because they're having to make very, very difficult choices between food and between heating. And, the cost of living crisis is hitting ordinary families. But if you've got a government that doesn't really, so I'm going to be quite strong in my language here, but if you've got a government that thinks more of the ruling classes than it does of the working classes, then they don't really have any comprehension of the disproportionate amount of income or benefits that are actually spent on food or fuel or the other things as well, let alone having some kind of life which is actually beneficial to your mental health and well-being as well. So I think that the government should actually turn the grants, just turn those into the loans that they're giving, they should actually turn them into grants so that they are not having to be paid back. I think that would actually make a significant difference where people don't have to constantly worry about getting into more and more debt by having to pay back the loans. So they should be converted into grants, I believe.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kaukab. What we'll do now is we'll move on to another story, which is of particular interest to Broadcasting Scotland and to our viewers as well, because interviews to select the new chair of Ofcom are due to start next week after the government admitted it had finally exhausted the hunt for potential candidates after almost 2 years of the process. The search to replace Terry Burns at the Telecoms, Media and Postal Regulator started in early 2020 when Lord Burns announced he was to stand down, and a successor was expected to be found by the end of that year, after the appointment of Melanie Dawes as Ofcom's new chief exec. However, the process has been dogged by delays after Boris Johnson's unsuccessful attempt to install Paul Dacre to push a more right-wing agenda at the body. The former editor of the Daily Mail unexpectedly failed the interview process the first time around. Ministers cleared the way for him to try again, only for Dacre to withdraw his application. The government had to abandon and restart the process, and the Partygate investigator and Whitehall fixer Sue Gray was put in charge of the interview panel. On Monday night, Julian Knight, MP, who's the chair of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, who has already called the process a shambles, said that the government had refused to tell him how many applications had been received and how many candidates were being considered for the shortlist. The government's second run at appointing Dacre with a new look interview panel came unstuck in December, when he unexpectedly pulled out of the process, days later announcing that he had taken a new role back at the publisher of the Daily Mail. In January, the government reopened the applications again for a week, closing on the 2nd of February, and the former ITV, Channel 4 and BBC executive Michael Grade said that he had thrown his hat in the ring. So, Kaukab, firstly, is it right that the Partygate investigator and Whitehall fixer Sue Gray has had to be put in charge of the interview panel after this process has run aground at least once, if not more? Has Miss Gray not got more important things to be looking after?
Yeah, I was wondering about the Sue Gray report and investigation and everything. I thought it had been a bit quiet, to be honest. So it's interesting to hear her name again connected with this. But yeah, we'll see what she says about it. I think sort of, I mean, it is very important that we, have a regulator for broadcasters. I think, we were talking about misinformation before and biased reporting as well. I think we're all sort of aware of how different stories are reported or not reported as well, even to the point of how people are referred to. You can refer to the Prime Minister, but somehow Nicola Sturgeon is referred to as Sturgeon. So even at that level, the messages that are given out. But yeah, as I was saying, I think, you have to have a regulator. That is really important. But there also has to be integrity in the process. And this process that you've just described there, I don't see where the integrity in that process is. So yeah, maybe Sue Gray is the person to come along and sort of like analyse it for any integrity there and try to instill some. But of course, these kind of public appointments, I mean, they have to be independent. They have to be independent. I mean, the government shouldn't be interfering in any of that, really. I mean, that would just be taking the biscuit, wouldn't it? If the government interfered in making this appointment and then telling us that, yeah, it's fair and open and impartial broadcasting. I don't think anyone would believe that for a minute.
No, absolutely. And as we heard, Julian Knight of the DCMS committee has already described the recruitment process as a shambles. Is it fair to say that this is yet another unnecessary shambles for a government which seems able to only create shambles after shambles with more or less everything that it touches?
Yeah, they can't seem to get it right for getting it wrong. And that is actually deeply, deeply worrying because the people of a nation have to have faith and trust in the leadership. So this is an issue and has been for quite a while that I don't believe, and a lot of people don't believe, that actually Boris Johnson commands that trust and certainly does not demonstrate leadership. And if they say, that what's that phrase, a fish rots from the head down kind of thing, I'm sort of thinking that that kind of attitude, if you don't get that kind of robust leadership from the top, then every other agency or layer that is connected, they start to almost sort of like absorb that kind of culture. And it's like, well, we can do what we want, and we'll just ride the storm, because let's face it, that's what Boris Johnson has done with all the other things. It's just like doubling down, not accepting responsibility, lack of accountability, and then just brushing it off. And then something else comes along, or there are other crises or distractions that are created, and people get on with their lives. But what's happening, of course, is that they're just getting used to doing it this way, and carrying on. I mean, if in any other company, Andrew, if there was a recruitment process that was run like this, I mean, it just would not be acceptable in any, and this is what we have. It's just totally laughable in that sense if it wasn't so serious.
No, absolutely right, Kaukab. I can only agree. The head of HR for such a company would be looking for a new job themselves. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Our final, our final story this evening brings us back to Scotland because apprentices are delivering a well-qualified workforce and addressing skills gaps in the NHS, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said today. Launching Scottish Apprenticeship Week, the First Minister met a group of pharmacy apprentices at University Hospital Monklands. A new £3.4 million Scottish Government recruitment programme will see 150 apprentice pharmacy technicians trained and recruited across Scotland this year. Throughout their 2-year apprenticeship, individuals will develop skills and gain valuable experience working in hospital and community pharmacies, as well as GP practices, undertaking medication reviews, liaising with other healthcare professionals to provide effective patient care. The First Minister said, growing our workforce is crucial, which is why we must increase the opportunities for our young people who wish to choose a career in the NHS, such as pharmacy, with quality hands-on training to set them on their path. Increasing the number of qualified pharmacy technicians is critical to ensuring a well-qualified workforce. So, Kaukab, firstly, is 150 new NHS apprenticeships for pharmacy technicians, is that a good enough start?
I think it's a good enough start. I would push the government further to, go further and go faster. They wouldn't be surprised to hear that from me. As an educationalist, I do think that all types of education, especially hands-on, is fantastic. And I'm a big fan of apprenticeships. When I worked in schools and we talked about sort of, developing young workforce, and we used to bring in the biggest bit that got the traction was when we actually brought in folk that were in work, and they talked to the youngsters about what they actually did, and made it very real and made them consider career options that maybe they hadn't thought of themselves, or indeed different career paths, and different educational pathways as well. So this is a little bit about positive destinations, and making sure that all of our young people find a positive destination. For some, that may be university. For some, it may be just going straight into work. And for some, it will be apprenticeships. So supporting apprenticeships, I think, is really, really important. I mean, I've had engagement with companies who take advantage of the funding that's available, and then they're able to put together bespoke training programs, but also get work out of the youngsters as well. So it's a great way actually to get that real experience of work, but also getting that training support as you go along. So yeah, I think apprenticeships is great, but I will and do constantly push the government to actually go further on that, to include as many of our youngsters and to concentrate on the young ones. Obviously, when you're filling skills gaps, it does take time to train people thoroughly. And I'm glad that we're sort of like continuing that process so that we can sort of like fulfill these skill gaps that are, that we have.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kaukab. And that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, culture and current affairs. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We rely entirely upon the donations and subscriptions that we receive, and so please, we would wish to encourage you, if you're able, to support us financially in order that we can do more of what we already do. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work on Broadcasting Scotland, either in front of the cameras or behind the scenes, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please go visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. I'd like to say thank you to Kaukab Stewart MSP for kindly joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Thanks, Kaukab.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think we've covered so many topics tonight, and I've really enjoyed having that chat with you.
Well, it's been great to have you too. Thank you for giving us your time so generously this evening. And I'd also like to thank everyone else who has been watching Broadcasting Scotland this evening. We will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. But meantime, I hope that everybody keeps warm and keeps well. Bye bye.